we should always fight to keep the ITC going, whether it's, in the most drastic ones, making it permanent at 30%, increasing it, right? Like our goal should be to lower the cost of solar even further.
And this is Scaling Clean, the podcast for clean economy CEOs, investors, and the people who advise them. I'm your host, Melissa Baldwin. Each show, we bring you usable insights from tested leaders that you can apply to the business of running your business. Shoot your shot. That's my takeaway from Yann Brandt, the voice behind our industry's go-to newsletter, SolarWakeup. Yann shared that as a CEO, by the time an idea got to him, it had been watered down, and he was eager to hear more ideas from different people. For nearly 20 years, Yann worked across the solar industry, in everything from residential to utility scale to manufacturing. Yann believes the next chapter for our industry will require taking risks, whether that means speaking up with a new idea, fighting for good policy, or taking a company public. Here's my interview with Yann Brandt. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So Yann, I'm so excited to have you here on the show. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Talk to us about your career journey and the evolution that got you from when you started to where you are today.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. Almost 20 years in January. Well, I have been in the solar industry. Started my career in C&I. I was a junior roofing engineer, and an architect for a school board said, "Hey, we got a grant to do some solar." And sitting here in South Florida, I was really enthusiastic about trying to figure out how to merge it with codes that didn't exist. And it was an interesting era because, the politics of the time was solar was a new technology. People always told me, you're really entering the next big thing. And this was in 2007. There was even a climate change summit that highlighted some of the solar technologies here in Miami in 2007.
Charlie Crist.
2008
Was that the Charlie?
with Charlie Crist.
Yes. Okay. I was at some of those summits, in fact. So it was the big new thing. I remember.
Yeah, and like RPSs were all over the place, and doing the net metering rules in Florida were a quaint affair amongst 4 industry folks and 1 utility lawyer trying to figure it out with PSC staff. And here I sit 20 years later, and 6 companies in through solar and storage, as you mentioned, both residential and utility scale. And the world is the same in many ways, but also vastly different, obviously with the scale where we're at. Just this year, solar surpassing coal capacity, solar surpassing gas in California over the first 5 months this year. And so here we are, really, catapulting solar into the next 20 years.
So I want to ask you more about the SolarWakeup newsletter. I feel like this is one of the industry's most beloved, most followed newsletters. How did you start that?
Well, it was an idea without a plan, and it kind of took off, right? So, there's a lot of newsletters that sort of give you the whatever industry segment you're in, tell you here's the news of the day. And they actually used to be, and I don't recall the name, every Sunday night there used to be a newsletter that came out in solar that had these were the press releases for the week from solar companies. And it was Sun Edison signs 2 megawatt deal with X utility. And I remember the feeling of dread on Sunday nights because it made me think that I was way behind, because everyone was doing all these press releases and I was selling 25 kilowatt projects. So it wasn't a few years later, actually NREL used to have something similar to this that due to budget cuts got cut off, that I wasn't actually aware of. Someone told me about it after I started SolarWakeup. And, but I had come home one day and thought to myself, there's a need for someone to say hey, this is what the news means, not just here are the news. And I sent the first newsletter to 37 people. I think 15 unsubscribed the first day because they're like, what is this? And it kind of looked like spam. And that was the week before RE Plus SPI at the time, 2012.
There are lots of people who want to get into your newsletter. Do you have any advice for them?
Because of my experience of reading press releases and feeling bad about it, I tend to press releases are not my thing. The best PR professionals in the solar space kind of know how I think about things. The very best actually send me the article and a draft blurb in my style. And I don't copy and paste it. But it does tend to say, all right, this is, take the article, put it into 50 to 80 words. What is the meaning to the reader? The ones that are most helpful are there's real content with real data that's valuable to the reader, and those tend to be pretty well included.
Well, let's move on now. I want to talk about the difference between public and private companies. Now, you've had the experience of leading both types of companies. What do you think people misunderstand about the differences between operating a public company versus a private one?
Both are difficult, but neither of them is impossible or something that people should shy away from. I actually tend to think, after having spent the last 2 years running a public company, that more solar companies and storage companies and service companies should be public. By design, solar people that have spent the last 10 plus years in solar, haven't spent a lot of time in public companies. There's just not that many public solar companies. And non-solar people struggle within the solar realm, which has caused some solar companies to not do well in the public markets. But that shouldn't dismay anyone. Just look at the IPO from Sol, for example, wildly successful. The going public of all the tracker companies, whether it's Next Power, Array, or FTC. There's just so much good that comes out of the transparency and the urgency that's created out of it. And so I think the main difference is one is an investment vehicle, meaning private equity, where you're trying to create positive financial outcomes, either by selling the company or creating a liquidity event like dividends or going public. Going public doesn't mean you have to sell a majority of the business. Quite frankly, most of the IPOs don't sell the majority of the business. They just create liquidity opportunity for all of the shareholders. Whereas being a public company, the way I tend to describe it to people is everyone thinks about it on a quarterly basis. Public companies that you are working with, whether they're a vendor to you or you are a supplier to them, they have 6-week windows, right? And it's really a 4-week window and an 8-week window. But there's a quarter end, and then there's an earnings call about 4 to 6 weeks later. And then there's the time between the earnings call and the quarter end again. Both of those are deadlines that are crucial to financial execution and what people can say on the earnings call. I've been really spending a lot of time educating people on how to help each other by saying what's important. And this timeline is really probably the best example that I would set forward of, what's the difference is just the time precision that you need as a public company is a lot more highlighted than a private business.
Yeah, absolutely. I've completely noticed that in the public companies that we've represented, how important that quiet period is, how we're timing announcements around all of that. Now I'm going to shift gears. I want to talk more about policy and politics. What did working in politics teach you about communication and leadership?
Solar is a regulated market. And it is, as we've seen through both the IRA and through O3B, is either at the table or on the menu, depending on how the wind blows. Solar should be both respected, and there's certainly efforts, and we've always wanted to be where solar is something that is feared. That's an evolution of maturity of the market. But being in solar means being involved in policy. It is probably the weakest point of our industry is that we think of ourselves as we should be non-political because we are bipartisan. But just because it's bipartisan on the voter side doesn't mean that it's non-political in DC because we are, as I said on the outset, we are competitive on it used to be on environmental benefits, but now strongly on a cost benefit and being able to get it up and running faster, competitive to the oil and gas and coal markets. And in DC, that matters. And we tend to ignore that fact. Um, and a lot of executives do it. And there was I thought it was a great article in E&E News recently where the Democratic whip, Brian Schatz, who I think is a very outspoken and opinionated senator that has a lot of power in DC, said something along the lines of renewable energy developers have been advocating against themselves for many years, so we'll just ignore them. And that is kind of how we view it. We think of ourselves as spectators in a full contact sport, and we think of ourselves as something that people will advocate for us without us sitting at the table, whether it's with money or with activations. We tend to be on the sidelines. And if you go back, residential was at its most powerful when it was kind of at its most aggressive, and it kind of got away from it from a financial perspective, and it was upsetting some parts of the market. And I'm starting to see some shifts in the solar sort of rooms that I'm in, where people are recognizing that policy is important, but more important than anything, whenever someone says, "Should I join the board of SIA?" I'm like, absolutely. And they say, why? I'll be one vote and we're not really, good at politics. Listen, it's 4 trade shows a year with the senior leaders of all of the companies you want to do business with. It's business development. You're spending more on exhibiting at RE Plus than you would as joining the board of SIA. It's business. Policy is business development, always has been, always will be. The byproduct is writing checks in DC through both, some of the vehicles that exist. That is going to make the industry more powerful, not just, oh, look, we built a factory, people should support us. Look at most of the factories in Georgia, to be frank. Those are all mostly in Republican districts. And because we weren't there at the fundraisers, et cetera, most of our incentives were still on the menu come O3B timeline.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's my next question. And you talked about sitting on the board at SIA. You have a front row seat to these policy battles. What concerns you most about the current political environment for solar?
Well, look, I don't want to be overly negative because I think we're recognizing those weaknesses, where we can do more. I'm really excited about seeing Tim Pawlenty step in. I had a few things that I wanted to see in the next CEO, and one of them was I really want a strong fundraiser. And who's a better fundraiser than a 2-term, governor of a purple state? But on the other hand, I'm excited about the other things, and many people that have read SolarWakeup in the past know how I feel about sort of the people should fear solar or the solar industry. Chip Roy was the loudest anti-solar voice during O3B. I would say he single-handedly killed the residential tax credit, which really sucks, to be honest. Like, allowing investors to get a tax credit and then as a homeowner, you can't take it. Like, I'm not a fan of that, and it doesn't change anything to the taxpayers in terms of the value that they're generating. It democratizes it a little bit. But Chip Roy took a lot of unnecessary shots that were personal in nature against the solar industry. And a few folks in the solar space decided, like, hey, he's running for a statewide seat in Texas. We're going to try to make sure he doesn't win his primary and not get a chance at that seat. And no one knows for certain what makes the difference in a race. But Chip Roy lost. And I love that the Don't Mess with Solar folks are taking credit for it. I'll give them the credit for it because everything matters. And there was a loud voice around DC of, what happens if you are anti-solar, which is supported on a bipartisan basis of voters on both sides. Being pro-solar is not something that's going to get you primaried because voters at the end of the day, that's not a single item issue for them. So being pro solar is not going to not help you get elected the next time, but being anti solar maybe could prove to be the end of your political career. And I like the nuanced delta that we're creating in that debate.
Absolutely. And it's like you said, I don't think that politicians are going to respect you until they fear you.
Look, I'll make a distinction between, it's true, right? Fear causes respect, right? But the part that I think we're doing a really good job is in our execution and our scaling, right? And like the respect is, look how far solar has come. The factories we've built, the ability for most of the modules that we need in the United States can now come from U.S. factories, and we're going upstream into the cell world, et cetera, that come into it. Even at an enormous tax on solar panels, we probably pay 300-400% more for solar panels here in the U.S. than our European colleagues do, just from duties and tariffs, et cetera. In order to get the domestic factories and manufacturing supply chain going, those are positive movements. Those are American workers and American factories building solar panels, and that's going to come to the battery world and inverter world. Those are all really positive movements in the right direction. And then the countless of jobs, in lawyers' offices and in financial offices and developers, all of that capital formation that's happening. Those are, amazing career opportunities, both for young people and the folks that have made their living in the space. So there's a lot of respect in that, right? When it comes down to it, obviously there's a lot of data center conversations happening. What's the fastest way to get power to and energy to those data centers? It's solar, because of the work we were doing 5 years ago to site and develop those solar projects. We have to do a lot more of that, right? We're using all of that pipeline for the data centers now, but the data center growth is not slowing down, between now and 2035. MISO alone is planning on increasing its peak demand by nearly 50% after spending the last 30 years growing at total of 5 to 10 gigawatts. They're going to grow 50 gigawatts in the next 10 years. So there's an enormous amount of growth that's happening across the country. And then there's obviously the national security and self-sufficiency that comes along with it. And I would highlight that one of the most resonant political sort of bargains that were really changed the energy paradigm globally, but solar was part of it, is in circa 2018 or so, or prior to that, there was a bill where the oil embargo was lifted and the solar ITC was extended in that same bill, right? So we went from where prior to that time frame, we weren't exporting oil anymore, or for many years, because we wanted to be self-sufficient with our own oil production. But at the same time, we said we also want to offset and create more opportunity for oil to be exported to make us more dominant. And now we're one of the largest, if not the largest oil exporter in the world. And that has created both power on a national security basis, but also power domestically. In Q1, 91% of all capacity built was solar. That's respect, right? And if you, as a policymaker, want to ignore that most of the capacity that's being built across the country is solar, that's going to come at an enormous price to pay, both of what the economic opportunities are for your district if you don't have the energy, but also what, now to your point about being feared, what happens if you go against solar, because there is a risk that the industry could activate against you in your next political campaign.
Mm-hmm. And I think you made a great point as well when you talked about just the growth of domestic manufacturing. I still see a lot of politicians who are pandering and saying, oh, all of this solar equipment is coming from China. So I think the industry, we still have a lot more work to do in getting that message out there that we've grown domestic manufacturing. And I think it's really just remarkable the amount of factories that have popped up, how much across the solar supply chain, cells, wafers, panels, what have you, just how many more new factories we built in the last 4 years here in the US. So I think that's a great point. You mentioned something earlier that I want to just touch on one more time, and that was the ITC. So you talked about the residential perspective. Can you just say a little bit more about that? I know there's this ongoing debate about the ITC in our industry. Do you think that it should be extended?
We should always fight to keep the ITC going, whether it's, in the most drastic ones, making it permanent at 30%, increasing it, right? Like our goal should be to lower the cost of solar even further. When solar is 91% of the capacity that's installed, one of the things that happens is we really put a ratchet on how much retail energy cost to consumers goes up. But there's all these investments that are happening on infrastructure and the cost of operating all of the other plants that's really driving the inflation of energy costs. We have no fuel costs, right? That is our biggest advantage. The only cost is CapEx. So one of the best things that Congress can do for affordability is to help lower the cost of CapEx of what was 91% of the capacity addition. And look, we want the policies of creating work, and we're building these mega projects, right? Like there are projects being built all over the place that represent 1% of the total expected capacity addition for the year on a single site, and multiple 1 gigawatt plus projects being built. Those are real tethers to the inflation that's really hitting consumers and renters across the country. In many ways, the ITC is an inflation reduction policy, right? And that's my argument for it, because when I think about building a solar project, the ability to lower the cost of the capex lowers the offtake that the utility or the consumer is going to pay. Here's the thing that most people, and this might be a little bit more nuanced, there's a new metric that comes into play when data centers are within your same energy system. So you and I, we probably pay, we pay somewhere 15 cents a kilowatt hour for our energy at home. We want to pay zero, right? That's the big thing about energy. It's the ultimate commodity. People want to pay nothing for their energy, and they want to run it, and they certainly don't want to not run their AC when it's hot out because of the cost of it. And it's a luxury that we have here in the United States. Is our energy turns on when we hit the light switch, and it's relatively affordable in most parts of the country. For data centers, there's a metric called the value of compute. Really, it's called the compute heat rate. And there's a moment where you would think about turning off the data center because the cost of energy is too high and the value of the compute is lower than the cost of energy. That is somewhere between 50 and 150 times higher than what you and I pay for our energy. So if you want to really think about how many of us would turn off our lights and our ACs and go without as much energy as we want if we weren't paying attention, it would have to be 20, 30, 40 times higher before the data center thinks about turning theirs off. And people don't realize there's that kind of a gap between the value of compute and the retail cost of energy. We have to build so much solar in order to continue to put a tether on it. And I really worry about the urgency that we have on it because people don't really think about both the aging infrastructure and what comes on. So to go back to your original question, we should always be very vocal about our desire and advocacy for the ITC extension. And as it says in the E&E News report, members of Congress feel more sure about this argument that the ITC should be extended and the sunset date shouldn't be now, it should be later, than the industry actually does. Because we're actually not that we don't like the policy. We're afraid of the fight and we're afraid of another cliff. And not everything is wrong about that because we do have to explain to investors, why should you invest in this development vehicle or this company? We need to make the argument that we can do well if the ITC doesn't exist, which we've now proven, right? The the safe harbor deadline is basically now. It's in 2 weeks. And, on the flip side, where we want the capital to continue coming in while also saying it's even better if we have an ITC. So we shouldn't be afraid of the fight, and we shouldn't be afraid of making the case to the capital markets.
It has been an interesting needle to thread, I think, for a lot of people in our industry who have to communicate both to investors and to policymakers about the desire for that extension, but also the industry's ability to, stand on its own 2 feet. So I want to shift gears now and talk about learning and professional development. So you obviously consume a ton of media. Are there any books or podcasts that you would recommend to our listeners who may want to become a CEO one day?
The way that I would dissect a business is probably with these couple of questions. Is how long does it take you to close your books? Let me see them, right? And that gives me a good sense of sort of your ability to run your business and know where you stand financially. I would tell you that deadlines spur action. So every promise without a deadline is, a hope and a prayer. And then the last one, I've really grown into this one over my years, is measure what matters. Everyone will tell you why they can have a dashboard of reportable metrics. I'm a creative, or I'm this, or I'll tell you this, my 9-year-old has a dashboard. Those three things I think are core to any company's success. But fundamentally, honestly, it's people just don't, like, this is when I go into rooms with people I know and I don't know, I tend to say something out loud to them. I'll say it out loud to you. Is I'm always very transparent on what's important to me. If I'm a company that's, trying to execute an XYZ, I share that goal with the person that can help me achieve it. Because human nature is we want to help each other. Especially in the solar world, I tend to think that we have this like unspoken camaraderie. And we are competitive, and, we can be certainly cutthroat industry. But sharing our goals with transparency with each other is people tend to want to help you and lift you up and get there. So I would tell more people, like, say what you're trying to achieve and then ask people for help. There's a lot of people that have seen things around the industry, myself included, that all have a perspective. And quite frankly, we're pretty accessible and just, time limited, sure. But people don't make the ask, and they don't ask the questions that they may think, we wouldn't want to answer, but they just don't try. And I think especially younger folks, like, I'll give you a great example. This one might backfire. If someone came to me and said, hey, how would you feel if I sent you some of my opinions and you think about including them in SolarWakeup? I would love that, right? Like, I started the SolarWakeup when I was, still in my 20s. But like, sure, like, what do I have to, like, it's not a commercial effort. But if you have a well thought opinion, and I might give you some feedback on it of like, what do I think? But no one's ever asked. Like, no junior person in the industry, says like, hey, I don't have a voice. But the reality is, yesterday when I gave the keynote, there was 150 people in the room. Every single day, there's something between 2,000 and 3,000 people opening the SolarWakeup newsletter. And that's a bigger room than the one I flew to Chicago to go speak in person at. But, make the ask. I always tell people, I'm like, just offer something, and you have to do the work, and you have to do the effort to learn a little bit, especially now in the era of AI. Everyone, outsources their thought processing and their thought leadership to a computer. Use it as a tool, but don't let it replace your original thought.
I'm curious, do you notice any generational differences in professional behaviors among like the junior crowd who's coming out of college right now versus, even like the whole, what is it, the millennials, the Generation X? Like, do you notice any leadership styles or communication pattern differences among those generations?
I don't love the hierarchy that a lot of young people feel compelled to like stick to. Meaning, if you have a good idea, like pursue it and push it. Uh, I've spent obviously the last 10 years or so at the higher levels of companies, and the number of ideas that are pitched to me are very limited, which means that if an idea is coming to me, it's been filtered and mediocred. I know it's not a word, but compromised with opinions and can't do and can't that. Um, and, I think we're doing a disservice to a lot of young people who don't know what doesn't work because they haven't learned the experience yet. Um, take more risks of, sort of upsetting the apple cart. Um, Listen, and this can backfire, right? Like if your boss doesn't like it, if you push too hard, listen, you might get fired. So it's not always the best advice to give, but honestly, if you're in an environment that isn't accepting of what you consider to be a well thought out good idea, um, then maybe you're not in the best environment anyway.
I do think that people get intimidated by those who they perceive as, having made it, and then like, oh, that person won't have time for me, or, oh, could I, reach out to them? So I love what you've been sharing. Thank you. So my last two questions, we like to ask this of everybody, and it's about your personal health and well-being. So what do you do, Yann, to keep yourself going? A lot of us are putting in long days, CEOs especially. You have a ton of demands. You probably go through days where you're back to back to back scheduled. So what do you do to recharge your battery?
It's all about balance, right? Like I like to go to the gym personally. Probably one of my favorite places at most companies to like absorb content, like going back to sort of the news junkie that I am. I love reading people's meeting notes about customer visits and the feedback that they're getting. Um, it's probably my favorite place to sort of see and feel like the company's heartbeat. And then the other one, I'm a huge fan of day trips. So for example, when I went to Midwest Solar Expo, it was Chicago. I flew up and back the same day. I will do a day trip to San Francisco, which includes a red eye back. But that has really worked for me. I don't think work-life balance is work and then home. I mean, this is for me, and I may be unique, and it's not for everyone, but I mesh the two wildly, meaning I work all the time, but I'm also trying to live all the time. And that has certainly gotten me through some of the harder moments I've had in my professional life, where really hard situations happen while I'm also sitting in a restaurant, having a nice dinner. So,
Boy, do I know that. I've been there. That's great advice, Jan. Um, Last question is just anything else that you want to share with our listeners that I haven't already asked you about?
the solar industry has been it's always at its best moment at the current time, right? There are positives and negatives, and people want to put a bow on, see, we don't need tax credits because look how great we're doing now. And it's always more nuanced than that, right? There are things that could be going better. Look at residential, which is, I love the residential solar market. I think it's part of the heartbeat of this industry that really drives a lot of positive sentiment. And I wish it wasn't going through the struggles that it's going through right now. And, because ultimately it's a rising tide lifts all boats situation. And so I want the industry to think bigger and bolder. Um, and, fundamentally just because I've always thought this is people need to be more involved politically. Spending time talking to local city councils, their state representatives, their members of Congress, helping, local community solar activists with the activation and to donate. There are plenty of places, and it gets tricky, with the various PACs that exist in the solar space and how they're allowed to raise money. As PR people and marketing people, we're always like, why don't you market this more? it's really difficult in the world of DC to do some of that fundraising. So people really need to seek it out. But people should be finding ways to donate $5, $10, $20 to various solar PACs. We're in a really exciting moment, both politically and the market that we've created. And we'll have new challenges, right? We'll have the 232 poly decision, which isn't going to be enjoyable for anyone. But we'll get through that as well. And then, maybe we'll have some positives with ITC extensions. And then obviously everything that's happening in the battery world is just completely changing the dynamics for the solar industry. And, that's certainly something to be excited about.
Absolutely. I'm really grateful for all the work that you've done, grateful for the SolarWakeup, and love the advice that you shared today. So thank you.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you having me on, Melissa.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Scaling Clean, the podcast for clean economy CEOs, investors, and the people who advise them. I'm your host, Melissa Baldwin. Our producer is Claire Quirin. If you like what you hear on Scaling Clean episodes, we'd appreciate it if you'd give us a 5-star rating and leave a comment where you get your podcast. And until next time, we wish you all the best in the clean economy transition.